And so, returning a little bit to to an issue that we talked about before, when we're talking about the risk to education, it can be maybe different for different people, different people who come from different regions, things like that. I mean, who are we talking about when we're talking about minimizing that risk? Like, who are the people that we really want to, work with and make sure that they don't take on too big of a risk?
I think the biggest problem or sort of indicator of bad outcomes is non-completion. We've talked about it, so I'm kind of repeating some of the things we said already, but if you talk to folks that service student loans, they tell you that defaults are very highly predictable by whether or not the student makes the first payment on time. And so we've got these people that are not just experiencing things later in life, and it's very, very difficult to model and predict. It's that these students get off track pretty quickly, and for the, I think probably the most severe and obvious instance of predictable hardship is coming from the non-completion. People, if we look at who shows the highest signs of financial distress measured by making late payments on any financial obligation within the household, like their cable bill, Netflix, anything. We see it actually among households that have the lowest levels of debt. So the rhetoric might have you think that households that have $100,000 in debt are really struggling. Statistically speaking, on average, those folks are doing just fine. It's the people who have very small amounts of debt. It's likely that these people have made small investments, not completed their degree, or maybe gotten a lower level degree. And these are the places where we're seeing financial hardship that are a pretty good indicator of being upside down on your investment that you've made in higher education.
Yeah, I think it's a tricky thing you're asking about, Jillian, because if we start to have a conversation of, risk is okay for some people and not okay for other people, really all we're going to end up doing is just amplifying and perpetuating existing equity gaps in our K-12 system and what community you're from. I mean, yeah, look, I live in Northern Virginia. I'm sure, like many people there, would be a safe bet to complete because we have great public schools. So I don't really, I think sort of saying who should we focus on is really missing the fact that we need to ensure better outcomes for our entire post-secondary system. I think for a long time, we've had a lot of success focusing on the question of access, and we've made progress in access, but now just across the whole system, we need to start to think about quality assurance and outcomes, because something that Kevin mentioned at outset, there are tons of places in this country where sort of college choice is this foreign concept because there's one school and it's within a 100-mile drive of anyone that lives out there. So if that one school is a school that has poor outcomes and is gapping students and is driving them into debt, you're trapping these people. So I think we can definitely address this through looking at new providers of post-secondary education, thinking about innovative ways, whether it's some of the online things that we've seen, but making sure that high-quality post-secondary education is available to everyone throughout the country and that there are good outcomes underpinning that. I think that's more important than thinking about sort of which group we should be more concerned about when it comes to risk.
Okay, well, I'll address the elephant in the room, and since I'm running for office one day, I think I have this down, like how to describe the situation. So we all, or people in the education community, want to encourage everybody to go to college. Unfortunately, not everybody is prepared to go to college, and I think most people can agree on that. And so there's this idea that we need to fill that sort of preparedness gap, and make everybody ready for college. The challenge is when you have, as Jesse just mentioned, when you have a majority of people that go to college within a 20-mile radius of their home, and for low-income students, it's actually higher. So I think it's about 65% of low-income students go to college within a 20-mile radius of their home. When you have colleges that are accepting students who may not be successful in college, but when I say that, I mean based on the performance in high school. So I'm talking about sub 2.0, like students that might have a 1.5, and you get a 1.5 just for showing up. So students who have maybe had real academic struggles or just didn't bother trying, but then have been encouraged or pushed, as whatever word you want to use, to go to college. Those aren't necessarily, you can predict those might not be good outcomes, and those are the students that are going to leave school and have debt and sort of struggle. And it's a really tricky proposition to focus on those students for the reasons that Jesse said. I mean, without going into, the history of American education, we've had historical inequities in access to education. And because of that, it's very difficult for us to be a country like someplace in Europe where we say, you either test into higher ed, and if you test into higher ed, great, you can continue, and we'll subsidize it, or you will go into vocation. While in other countries where they actually build things, going into vocational opportunities could be a path where you could achieve economic self-sufficiency. Unfortunately, with the advancements in manufacturing and loss, however you want to describe it in this country, that's not necessarily feasible. So what we have, and particularly this phenomenon is kind of writ large in Massachusetts, you have these schools that are accepting students, and I don't like using the term marginal students. I'll say students who are most likely not to be successful, maybe that's a better way to put it, who are getting into schools. And what was your expectation? Was your expectation that a student with a 1.5 GPA was all of a sudden going to go to college and magically the lights would go on and they would make Dean's List? Like that's not. I mean, it's not sound. It's not sound policy. And so because in years past when the gaps weren't that large or when the debt wasn't that the debt amounts weren't that great that people were leaving school with. It could happen, and sort of we're not sort of seeing them as severe consequences because we're dealing with smaller amounts, right? But it kind of with the push, it's like an unintended consequence of saying everybody should go to college without saying it as post-secondary education and defining post-secondary education as almost a suite of different opportunities that doesn't just mean four-year college. And so it's a combination of identifying students who may not be successful, not discouraging them, but it's almost like, is there almost like a waiting area? Is there like a holding pattern or things or skills building that students could do so that they could eventually go on and be successful in higher education and be in the majority of the students that Jesse was talking about, the 40% of students that are over age 25. But when they go immediately without being poorly academically prepared and having these huge gaps, it's just a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, and so, Kevin just brought up kind of the role that schools may play in some of this risk. I'm wondering, I mean, what do you think the role of schools is in mitigating the risk? Like, should we expect a school to tell somebody, this is too much debt to take on to attend here? Is that reasonable? What do you think they should be doing here?
I'm going to cheat and answer a different question.
No, go ahead.
Let the rest of the panel answer that one. But a related question.
Yeah.
So I'll leave it to you guys philosophically, what should schools be doing? And I'll answer what some schools are doing, which I think is an interesting thing.
Yeah.
So we've seen some innovations in recent years where institutions are recognizing that students are aware of risk as an issue for them. They've recognized that students are coming to them, like the student that Kevin was talking about, and saying, look, I get that this is probably going to be worth it, but I can't afford the downside that it's not. And so what we're seeing from really a very small set of institutions of a particular type even, is that they're creating the notion of guarantees into their system of education. So we've seen it in, that is a general catch-all term, but what it describes is that there's some sort of promise or promise to fulfill service to the student. We've seen it in a few different ways. The first way I saw it was institutions offering a 4-year on-time graduation guarantee, which says if the student goes to all their courses, meets with their advisors, does what they're supposed to do, but they can't get through their coursework in 4 years because of scheduling or whatever, they go for free until they finish. So this takes some of the downside risk away from the students. Other institutions and skill training programs are offering job placement guarantees. They're saying if you don't get a job that gives you an income of this much within 6 months after graduation, either we'll give you your money back or you can come back and get another degree. So these are institutions not doing this because of some sort of regulation, or I don't even think out of some desire to do good for society, but more that they're in a marketplace and they're trying to compete for students, and they recognize that students are seeing this risk and are averse to it, and so they have developed these sorts of innovations. And I think we're going to see more and more in that space. We've talked about risk sharing as a potential piece of legislation going forward with reauthorization of HEA. But I'm particularly excited about what the institutions themselves are coming up with in terms of ways to mitigate risk for students.
Yeah, that notion of a money-back guarantee is an interesting one, because I think that sort of consumer-level messaging would be very resonant, sort of saying, attempt this, and if it doesn't work out, there might be sort of back-end protection for it. I think that's compelling. But on that topic of consumer information, we have not traditionally done a great job making kind of clear information available to students and families as they are going through that choice process. We saw a big step over the past couple of years with the data that the Department of Ed has released related to the college scorecard has definitely moved us in the right direction in terms of sharing some information about, sort of job and employment outcomes for students that are kind of like you. I forget actually how they phrase it, but that was a good first step, but a lot of the data that we need to measure these outcomes for policymakers to make good decisions, for consumers, for students and families to know what they need to know, we're still prohibited from having that data and using that data in the effective ways that we need to. And I think that's a huge shift that we need to see happen in terms of getting that out there. But to answer Jillian's question, because I'm a responsible panelist, in terms of something that's cool. Well, okay, so I'm gonna take a point of privilege on one thing, which is you said schools, and I prefer to think of providers of post-secondary education, because honestly, we are seeing so much more diversity in this space in terms of what someone that is providing this learning after high school looks like, where they are, how you're engaging with them. All of these new pathways are tremendously meaningful for a lot of students and families out there. So thinking of, I think when we, and to what Kevin was just talking about, I think we hit a barrier when we talk about is someone college material? Because inherent in that word college, we have this baked in cultural notion of a 4-year residential experience. And that I think then kind of alienates a big group of people, because they're like, well, it doesn't work for the time that I have, doesn't work for my own educational background. But when we start to talk about post-secondary learning, that means a lot more things and can take place in a lot of different places. We see learning conducted by employers, on the job. We see a ton of learning for our servicemen and women in the military. And we don't do a great job currently credentialing this learning in a way that makes sense to employers. So I think one of the things that we could see happen, and whether it's sort of this notion of schools doing it, but more broadly all providers, is we need a transparent national system of credentialing so that everybody sort of has a shared understanding of what types of learning we're talking about, how to recognize that learning, so that employers can look at these things and actually know who it is that they're hiring. And to share, sort of to bring this back to the conversation about risk, I was reading Beth's book on the plane on the way up. There's copies available in the lobby. If you haven't read it, I would encourage everyone here to read it. You're welcome. That's right. I'll bill you later. But in it, Beth talks about the notion of how bad luck contributes to risk and how often bad luck is utterly out of the control of someone. And she uses the example of someone that gets a very specific credential working with the technology that then gets phased out through no fault of their own. And in our current system, that person's kind of out of luck now because they have this very specific credential. But what we instead need to be doing is recognizing the learning that underpin that credential. So yes, now you may not be able to work on that specific technology that doesn't exist anymore, but the fundamental learning that went into it is still good and can have other application with other employers, and we need to be able to demonstrate that for people so that we can sort of take away the risk of that bad luck for changes that people don't have control over.
Yeah. So what can schools, what is schools' responsibility in this issue? And so it's interesting. I was at the College Board Forum last week in Chicago, and I gave a presentation on how much debt is too much debt. And, it's a complicated answer, and tried my best to do so in 75 minutes. But one of the interesting things that I took away from that was one of the comments from a financial aid administrator who said, we, in our best efforts, attempt to communicate to families the risk that they are about to undertake. And so it's a very delicate balance for us because we want to present the risks without being patronizing or authoritative, but paternalistic, I think was the word she used. And so and she said, despite our best efforts, what do you do if you're telling a parent, here's your gap by $20,000 or $30,000, you may not be able to afford this. We're talking about affordability. And the parent's like, I don't care, I'll do whatever it takes. At that point, your responsibility as a school, you've met your obligation. You can't tell them you can't come. And I think schools are very sensitive in having these conversations because they don't want to get into any sort of accusations of discrimination, right? So because there's a heightened sensitivity about talking about, money and economics and those types of things. So I said, well, that's interesting, and then another gentleman in the audience asked, well, should schools be need aware instead of need blind? And of course I make the mistake of saying, well, is any really school need blind? And of course, everybody in the room was like, of course, yes, we're need blind. And I was like, I don't think so. And I was like, wait, know your audience. Rule number one of public speaking, know your audience. So I was like, all right. No, they think they're need blind. So, all right. So, and I was like, all right. So then I shifted and I said, well, because he's like, well, should we be need aware? And I was like, okay, you may be need blind. I'm saying in my experience in working out of college, I'm not going to name any names, even though we were in need blind, when people in admissions are reading the common application and they're noting the zip code of the family and they're looking at the job that the parent has, they're making mental notes. They're actually saying out loud, this family's good, this family's good. Why are they applying for financial aid? Look at where they live. They live in Greenwich, Connecticut. Wow, the Rodeo Drive of the East Coast, right? So it's not to say that you can't be, that philosophically doesn't work in your packaging, but what ended up happening was I relayed this story that we weren't able to fund undocumented students. There are some schools in this region that can fully fund undocumented students. And so we had this letter that we sent out. It wasn't an admit letter, it wasn't a rejection letter. It was a letter, and the gentleman was third in his class out of 472 at Charlestown High School. I'm not gonna name his name, obviously, but it said, you are an outstanding student. You will no doubt have a great career, and we wish you well. Unfortunately, we are not able to fund you to any sort of level that would make it possible for you to attend this school. And that was the letter. It wasn't an accept, it wasn't a wait list, it wasn't a deny. It was just, we don't have the funds to fully fund you. And some would argue, well, that's not your place as a school, you should leave it up to the parent to decide. And I would make the argument that that is a possibility. And in fact, schools already do that. Because I said, can we all agree, this is a politician in me, and to the room in Chicago, I was like, can we all agree that admit deny exists? And by admit deny, I mean there are schools that will admit students, but it'll be a kind of a deny in parentheses because it'll be a financial aid package that is just insurmountable. So you're admitting the student with the hope that they look at the financial aid and determine, this is way too risky, I'm not gonna go here, right? And so it's not like we don't wanna reject you, but we'll just make it not feasible for you to attend due to finances. And so I was like, can we all agree that admit deny exists? And everybody's nodding in the room. I'm like, yeah. All right, well, maybe admit deny will morph into something else in the future, in between admit deny and giving a letter that we can't fully fund you. And again, we'll start to see that here on the East Coast first, before maybe it trickles westward. But if you look at a debt map of the United States, on the West Coast, they have half of the debt that they have here because people are already utilizing two-year schools, are already utilizing state schools, and so there's not sort of the same challenges. So I think what schools can do is sort of maybe refine their approaches and sort of do some, I don't know, get some outside consultants or like videotape themselves on the phone with people and like have some and have somebody review like, well, do you realize the messages that you're transmitting? Because it's almost like learning financial aid is like learning a completely new language. I often tell people like I feel much the equivalent of like Rosetta Stone. Like I have to like be the translator because there's all these terms that that if you work in the industry, you know all too well. But these are people who this is the first time, especially if they've gone to public school their whole life, that they've ever paid for school at all. So it's like what we talked about earlier, which is you start from zero as if they have no knowledge. Yes, you have a net price calculator on your website. Yes, you may be putting the information out there, but you have to assume that they're just starting with Jack and Jill goes up the hill. Like they're starting with the most bare bones of knowledge, and then you're helping them from that.
Great. All right. Maybe, yeah, let's open it up for questions. I see some hands over there.
Hello. Just to jump on your topic, so I'm a financial aid counselor at State School Mass Art. I went to school for 2 degrees in classical music, so I took out a lot of private debt. And what I found is when parents call to say, hey, my first child going to school, you're right, they have no idea about any of the lingo. I didn't either until I started working there. But what I find is when I explain, this is what the situation is, this is how you apply, this is where you get financial aid, there's going to be a huge difference. I used to work at a private school. There's going to be a huge difference have you prepared for that? And they say, no, this is the first time we're talking about it. So in the idea of minimizing risk for borrowing, when they get to me, it's too late. They're 18. Like, where's that money coming from? So what is in place organizationally, private organizations, to talk to families, not in high school, not in middle school, but to families who just are having kids who are 5, 6 going into K through 12, to be prepared to say, you're going to have to pay for education. These are the steps you need to start taking to make that happen.
So that's a great question. And I think the approach that I've started to take is that we're having this sort of debate whether higher ed is a public good or a private good. So in the policy arena, we need to make the argument loud and clear that it's a public good and get state investment to pre-recession levels and, have a strong, robust public option and make the case that it's a public good. To individuals, you make the case that it's a private good and you prepare them accordingly by talking about savings and doing these things like obviously at a much earlier age than 18. But that's the sort of the dynamic at play here is that, we have to recognize that it is, for all intents and purposes, seen as a private good. And you have to prepare people to make good consumer choices, to make good, sound consumer choices, as they would with any larger consumer purchase. But then you have to also, you can't then abandon the idea that this is a public good and still make the argument in public arenas, in policy forums, in summits such as this, that it is a public good and we need to make that investment.
Oh.
Hi there. Can any of you comment on the efficacy of the FAFSA as a tool to assess risk? And I'm specifically thinking of the message that the expected family contribution communicates.
Sure, I'll take a stab at this. So I think we need to start with the understanding that the EFC is basically a rationing device to disperse federal aid. There's no action. I mean, the instances of someone actually paying what their EFC is at any given school are very small. So if you're saying that the consumer information on the FAFSA, does that help people sort of make choices? I think the answer is probably no, not as much as we would like. I mean, we have seen some good strides this year in terms of moving the FAFSA date back from January to October, switching to using income that's readily available at the time of application to use the automatic data retrieval tool. These are very good changes. I think it's going to lead to more students and families being able to complete a FAFSA and also then to be able to have that information while they're going through the admissions process. These are positive things. But, I think a huge misconception too is, remember, the FAFSA is just a form that's gathering information about a family. Like, in and of itself, there's nothing magic there. So I don't know that it's particularly effective in terms of managing risk, as we've sort of been talking about that today. I don't know if you have other thoughts too.
So
Yeah, go ahead.
So I too, in my past life,
there's the
was
voice
in
going, okay.
the financial aid industry, have now switched to the other side. And oftentimes I would have students and parents in my office that I would be dealing with that you would explain all the information, like Kevin said. You'd have that conversation with them. You would say, I don't think that this is the best choice for you, even though admissions is banging on your door telling you not to tell them that. Yet you have this parent or the student that feels it's their student's right, essentially, to be attending your institution. It's their dream. It's you're destroying everything that they've had. So how would you communicate to financial aid administrators? How do you have that conversation? How do you change that parent's mind to show them what the future is potentially going to look like for their student?
Man, emotions are hard, right? I think what you're pulling at there is a very important thing, which is we are talking about, there's $140 billion in the federal student aid system. We're talking about large amounts of money being invested in something that has an economic imperative for this country, which is ensuring that we have the talent we need for our employers and our economy going forward. But at the same time, there is this huge personal, emotional component to it, whether it's going to a school that your parents went to, whether it's going to a school that you fell in love with when you were young. And so all of this distorts the decision-making process. There's actually, and Beth might be able to comment on this, there has been really interesting work done recently in the behavioral economics space related to higher education and sort of how this choice architecture comes together and where you can actually reach people and try and sort of guide them in different directions through this decision-making process. I don't think it's the job of a financial aid administrator to convince someone one way or another. I think financial aid administrators can get good information in a timely fashion. They can ensure that their award letters are as clear as possible, that they define grants as grants and loans as loans, and sort of give students and families the tools that they need to kind of assess that decision. But at the end of the day, it's not going to be your job to make someone's decision for them, nor would that really be an appropriate thing to do, quite candidly. But I think the behavioral economic stuff can kind of have an impact in this space.
Yeah, I think we're working on it. So I think the problem starts long before, the situation you're describing, which we unfortunately always say, but, and it's that we don't have a culture around college decision-making and spending that is based on cost-benefit analysis. So this is this notion of the emotions around this decision. It's sort of foregone conclusion that they're going to do whatever they can to get through once they've got their foot in the door. And focus group research confirms this. When you talk to people about the process of completing financial aid, it seems that they hit a point where they'll sign just about anything to get either themselves or their child enrolled for that semester. And that's anecdotal. I don't know how pervasive that notion is, but it seems like it describes a lot of what's happening. And there's also evidence that even though these conversations are happening, and I'm certain that they're happening because I talk to financial aid officers, that this information doesn't remain salient for the borrower. So perhaps they're quickly dismissing, the conversation or the facts of the conversation because with survey research, we can look at what students believe they're borrowing compared to what they're actually borrowing. And when the interviews take place just a matter of a few months after they've had this conversation inside their promissory note, they can't tell you within any reasonable amount how much they've borrowed, and many of them will tell you they don't have any debt at all, even though we know through administrative data that they do. So I don't know what to tell you. But I do think that it needs to come from a broader change in the conversation about decision making. And we no longer can just say to students, college is the silver bullet solution to your financial woes. Get through it and you'll be fine. It has to be, look, college is a great opportunity. Shop in a savvy manner for the degree that you're going to obtain, and you're going to be just fine. So.
And I would say that I started to, in my own personal work, I've started to appeal to that emotion to parents in that, doing a financial aid presentation for, a bunch of parents, it's this idea that all parents in the room can understand the concept of keeping your kids physically safe. If your kid comes to you and says, I want to go to a party where people are jumping off cliffs and there's funny substances about, you'd be like, no, that's not safe. I don't want you to do that. There's too much risk involved. So I've sort of expanded that, and I say, you can grasp the concept of keeping your kids physically safe, and now I want you to expand that definition to include keeping your kids financially safe. And if a financial, now again, as Jesse pointed out, this is probably not your job as a financial aid administrator, but if someone were to have that conversation with that parent and say, have you thought about protecting your students' long-term financial interests and keeping your kid financially safe? That's a much different conversation than we absolutely have to go to the school or the sky's going to fall. And, are you prepared to have your son or daughter live with you until they're 25? Would you rather your son or daughter live with you now and have a different option and then be financially independent at 23 and all the advantages of being young and 20 and footloose and fancy free? And those are much different conversations than we have to go to the school. And I will tell you, just from personal experience, I've had those conversations where it's the emotional. I don't even know what you want to call it, but it's so powerful. I talked to a woman who said, "You don't understand. I don't have a choice. I have to send him there." And I was a little bit puzzled. I had kids at this time, but I was still a bit puzzled. And I was like, "No, you have a choice. You don't have to." And it was like, "No." I told him if he did all the work he was supposed to, he did his job. He was a good student. He got into the school he wanted to do. He held up his end of the bargain. Now it's my obligation as his parent to hold up my end of the bargain. And I think that's where we sort of lose sort of the rationality of this choice, and we're not looking at it in a context of, purely cold, calculated, think with your head, not with your heart. And one of the ways I think to do that is to then talk about what financial safety, and then again incorporating this element of making sound choices and minimizing risk.
Great. I think I saw it over there. Yeah.
Just going back to, I think it was Jesse talking about, it's not the financial counselor at the college is a responsibility. I guess I really would love all of you to address, like this seems to be a consumer protection issue. Who is responsible? Because there are so many institutions, nonprofit as well as for-profit, that really, in a lot of ways, are predatory. And so what can we do as advocates for these young people or older people that are looking for education, so looking for quality? We don't talk about quality. How do we know what we should be buying? And who is responsible? I loved your delineation of public good or private good. And it is really important for our country or a state or a region, but who really holds the bag here?
Yeah, and let me be perfectly clear. I was saying they are responsible for doing their jobs well. I was saying they are not responsible for saying go to this school, don't go to this school. At the end of the day, that's going to be something that only students and families can determine. But I think your question about consumer protection gets at this bigger question of, like, what does our quality assurance system look like? If we can strive for a system that is making sure that as many providers as possible, ideally all providers, are having good outcomes, then we start to mitigate a lot of this risk. We start to ensure that there are these different options. One of the things that's driving this, this emotional conversation about there being good schools and bad schools and ideal options and not, it's this acknowledgement that there are some providers out there that aren't doing a very good job, and that getting into certain schools is going to set you on a right path. So I would love to move in a direction where there are way more of those sort of post-secondary providers that are going to have great outcomes. And currently our quality assurance system has a bunch of different actors with competing motivations. Our accreditation process is a peer-driven process that really kind of has continual improvement at the heart of it, which sort of makes them inefficient regulators of ultimately access to Title IV financial aid. So I think looking at a system where we have kind of a differentiated response to schools based on their track record of success, and really making sure that the providers we're letting into this system are going to give our students the results that they need, I think would be an important movement in the direction that you're talking about.
To describe the current system, at least, what we have is the set of safety nets that are financed by taxpayer dollars and not the institutions. So the institutions are the beneficiary of our federal aid system through grants and access to lending, yet it's the taxpayers who are on the hook in the case that a student faces a bad financial outcome and is not able to repay their student loan. There is a conversation happening in Washington about potential legislation, as I said, for risk sharing. And I think we've seen a couple concrete proposals, but it's really still a sort of a fuzzy concept. But what it says is that we want institutions on the hook for some of these defaults, right? So we've got students who are defaulting, going into forbearance, and potentially facing extended repayment periods and ultimately forgiveness for their student loans. We don't want taxpayers facing that bill. We want institutions facing that bill, so that on the front end they have an alignment of incentives, so that there's essentially some sort of market discipline for the dollars that are coming through the federal lending program. And so I think we're likely to see some movement in that space in the coming year or two.
Hi, I've heard a lot in this room and just outside in the national conversation when it comes to who's responsible and when it talks to prices going up. There's always talk about the federal aspect of it and the aid. There's talk about the institutions themselves and where they're setting their prices, and there's also talk about families and how much of that responsibility is theirs. In your work, all three of you, have you seen a correlation at all between when states began disinvesting in their public institutes of higher education and student loan debt going up? And have you seen that start to turn around at all and come back? Or has it really not impacted it as much? Is federal aid really the bigger thing that people are concerned about when it comes to that?
Well, we know that federal aid has not kept pace with inflation in higher education. So taking that piece alone, that contributes to a portion of the increased reliance on federal aid. We've also seen a disinvestment or a lower per student funding at state institutions, driving up the cost for students at those institutions in the public system. So that necessarily plays a role as well in the increase in debt. I can't say that I've seen any studies that sort of parse out to what degree each of those factors explains the changes we've seen overall. Maybe one of the other panelists has, but.
No, I was just going to say that I was on the phone last week with a reporter from Idaho who was talking about, well, why does Idaho have more student debt than any other state in the West? And we had talked about state disinvestments, and even in a state where they have that issue, it's contentious about like, well, how much do we actually? Each side is blaming the other, and so it's like they want to invest more in higher ed, but they can't agree on how to make it work procedurally, and so it's. I would say that most people can recognize that there's a correlation between state disinvestment and rising tuition, and then increased borrowing. But the next step is how to address that and bring funding back to pre-recession levels, and even support it more. Is where sort of the rubber is meeting the road, and how to make that argument. I had just mentioned that if a potential employer was looking to relocate to Idaho, one of the factors that employer might consider is and Jesse touched on this as well, is the amount or the availability of the educated workforce to support that organization. And you can either pay now or pay later, like pay now and invest and have that workforce to attract businesses, or you don't and then you pay for it later with social services or public assistance or whatever.
All right, I think we have time for one or two more.
Yeah. The question that I have is with regard to the financial aid process, and that is that do you think we've actually oversimplified the process of applying for financial aid, especially when it comes to borrowing loans? And I say that primarily because I remember when I was buying my home and the stacks of paper that I needed to sign, and eventually I had, pen in hand, and I said, boy, this is actually happening. Mm-hmm. And I think that with the financial aid process, with some students with borrowing, let's say, a PLUS loan, it's walking into your financial aid office and just completing a sheet of paper. Mm-hmm. And there you have it. $30,000 or $40,000 is now being borrowed. Do you think that perhaps maybe technology has done something to not allow the student, the consumer, to really take a step back and think about the process and how much they're borrowing?
Yeah, I sort of call it the iTunes effect. Like when you go and click on the new iTunes user agreement, and if you actually open it up and it's like, whoa, 10 pages long, but you're just like, look, I just want to download Adele's new song, and you just click on it. And, similar to exit counseling, as the previous panelist mentioned, or if you want to consolidate your loan through, studentloans.gov, and you could go through all the things, but you just click to get through, right? So there is some of that, but because that, again, we get to this issue of like, well, you want to make it simple for people to take advantage of, but are we actually causing harm now? Is the return on investment worth the risk, or should there be means testing for PLUS? Like, because you can borrow up to the cost of attendance, should there be limits on PLUS? Or there's limits on Grad PLUS, but are there limits on Parent PLUS? And those are the conversations that I think.
Yeah, and I think this is the part where I out myself as former financial aid administrator for 6 years. Is Eileen O'Leary here? I know she signed up. Anyway, I also worked for the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. So to your point about simplification, I want to stress few things are as important as simplifying our aid process and making sure that is not a barrier for students as they make their way into our system, because I think one of the things that is driving this persistent equity gap is the fact that sort of hassle processes like applying for financial aid have really meaningful effects. So I think it is a very noble and important effort to make the process for applying as streamlined as possible. I think we should move in an ideal direction where really the application process is just filing your taxes and your eligibility is assessed as part of that. To your question about signing a piece of paper and suddenly having debt, I do want to point out, you are never going to sign a single piece of paper and get $30,000 worth of debt unless you're a grad student. If we had another hour, we could totally talk about grad borrowing, distorting the whole conversation about student loans. But I think your question about sort of how is the information breaking through for students and families, are they able to understand, is a really important one. I know Beth has done some work on this. Our colleague Jason Delisle, when he was at New America, did some focus group work on this. And it is tough, particularly for young adults, to kind of understand the full scope of what they are doing, particularly right now because it is kind of an incremental process. You know, your freshman year you take 5,500, and your sophomore year you take 6,500, and all of a sudden when it's all said and done, you might have that $30,000 or $40,000 that you mentioned, but it kind of happens in this incremental fashion that it's hard to get the scope. So I know there's been initiatives that discuss, I think Indiana has been doing this, where their award letters actually say, like, you are on pace to borrow this sum total of money. If you make this choice instead, you will have this lower sum total of money. And I think those are all very important initiatives because at the end of the day, we want to empower people with the right information at the right time. But ultimately, you know, it's tough to sort of just ultimately prevent them from signing that piece of paper and you know, having access to those resources.
Got it. All right.
I don't know, yeah. But.
Oh, last one over there. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Bob Hildreth from Inversant. I wanted to ask a question about what you three think about the college aid letter, the financial aid letter, excuse me, going back to certain consumer issues. I've gone through many financial aid letters on behalf of the students and families that are in my program, and I seem to miss three things. The first thing I miss is that during their 4 years, the tuition will go up. No mention of subject to change. The second thing that I don't see is I don't see that the college award, the discount, if you will, the college award that they see in the financial letter will, in most cases, go down because most colleges front load them. And then the third thing I don't see is I don't see any terms on the loans, interest rate, repayment periods, or final disbursement. And I see those things on car loans. So do we have any issues of transparency in the college financial aid letter? Thank you.
I think those are excellent points, and I agree almost completely. And I think the research supports the argument that you're making that we have insufficient transparency in the process and that students certainly don't have full information when they're making these decisions. And it's likely that they'd make different decisions if that information were completely available to them. I'm not sure what to do about it. Maybe my panelists have the answer.
Well, much like FAFSA simplification, there is agreement in the higher education community that this is a challenge that needs to be tackled, but it's not so much the what or the why, it's the how, right? And so obviously one way to differentiate is to say, this is grant, this is loan, to not include plus, a parent plus in a financial aid award letter. And it's interesting because most of the colleges that I've sort of spoken with and interacted with over the last few years kind of are like, well, we don't want the government to dictate to us what a universal financial aid award letter would look like. At the same time, we know that if we don't get our act together and sort of figure this out on our own, it will be dictated to us. But since the Higher Education Act hasn't been reauthorized in however many years, they're like, well, by the time that eventually happens, like hopefully we'll figure it out. So there's an idea that this needs to happen, but there's not really a sense of urgency. So I mean, as we look at solutions, I mean that's a clear-cut solution right there, is to advocate for greater clarity in financial aid letters. I know I was at Boston Latin Academy a few weeks ago, and they work, I believe, with You Aspire to sort of have like a financial aid translator. So all the kids bring in their financial aid letters to the guidance counselors, and then they have like a translator, a Rosetta Stone, or like whatever you want to call it, and then they put all the terms in there, and then they have a conversation about, okay, here's the picture. Now, should they have to do that extra step? No. Am I glad that they do? Absolutely. And hopefully we'll get to a point where the letters themselves are clear enough and transparent enough that they don't have to take that extra step. But that's just an example of where we're at right now.
Yeah, I think one of the limitations we're facing in having this conversation is we're using the word letters, and we're thinking about like physical letters that you're laying on a kitchen table and comparing side by side. I know many institutions have been leveraging technology platforms to have more interactive award notifications that share some of the information you're talking about as you hover over certain parts of the letter. And I would also be remiss if I didn't point out that NASFA does have a code of conduct when it comes to creating award letters in terms of certain things that you can and cannot do that kind of gets at some of the concerns you're addressing. But one thing that I do really want to mention is the whole conceit of getting multiple financial aid award letters and comparing them and choosing a college based on information. That is still a minority experience in this country. Most students are looking at one school. Most students are sort of getting the aid that is available at that institution and making decisions based on things about their work schedule or when their daycare is available. So while, yes, we should make the process of comparing multiple award letters as streamlined as possible, as accurate as possible, let us not confuse ourselves into thinking that that is the single biggest barrier facing everyone in post-secondary education right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
I thought of an answer, so I'll jump back in too. I'm breaking all the rules today.
You're
But
just a rebel,
rogue,
Beth.
I know. One idea that I've written about that I think could help to a degree without some sort of regulation on what these letters look like is I have argued that we should have a single loan and single grant program for federal student aid. So instead of students looking at an award letter that has a variety of different types of loan products coming from federal government, if we had a single loan product, a single grant, then it would be easier for students to use these sorts of additional resources to understand what is being offered to them. And I think there's a lot of advantages beyond this instance, but it works here as well.
Got it. All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming, and thanks to our panelists.
Thank you.